Hi everyone, welcome to this live stream. I do apologize to everyone for the delayed start of this live stream. We ran into some technical difficulties as we got started. Today's live stream panel is going to be sharing some tips to pass the ITIL 4 Foundation exam. We'll even take some time to look at some of the questions from the sample paper, and our panel of experts will give their opinions on how, as a student, you can approach the question and get to the correct answer. So let me introduce this panel that we have for you. It's probably the best panel we've ever put together. And I'm going to start going in clockwise from the lower left-hand corner of my screen, which might not be the same as what you're seeing. I fully appreciate that. But in the lower left-hand corner of my screen, first is Claire Agata. Claire is the founder and one of the principal drivers behind the wonderful training provider called ITSM.zone, right? ITSM.zone, based here in the UK, but it's an online training provider, and of course her courses are delivered across the world. Not just ITIL, there's a lot of really good content available through her website, so I do encourage you to take a look at that. Next on my screen, we have Kakeru Ikubo, whose last name I've probably butchered completely. I apologize, Kakeru. Kakeru is a trainer with ITpreneurs in Japan. You don't quite live in Tokyo, but close to Tokyo, if I remember correctly. Outside of ITIL training, Kakeru is also quite active in delivering training and consultancy on a wide variety of topics, including DevOps, working with DASA out there in Japan. Next up, we have Stuart Rance. Stuart's been a long-time contributor to ITIL, going back, I believe, even to ITIL version 2 days. Most recently, he has been the lead examiner for ITIL 4 and has been the driver behind designing the exams and the style of the questions that we created for each of the exams in ITIL 4. Next up, we have Stuart Rance offers not only training, but consultancy as well through his company called Optimal Service Management. He's also a very active blogger, not only on his own website, but for a vast variety of websites across the ITSM ecosystem. Next, we have John Custy from the JPC group based out in Boston. John is a longtime ITIL trainer, but is also active in a number of other fields, which we were just talking about before we started this call. So John's been working in areas such as governance, quality management, audit and compliance, and various others. And last, but certainly not least, lower right of my screen is Vishal Vyas from Nolathon IT, based out of India. I think, Vishal, you're based out of Pune specifically, right? You're on mute, Vishal.
Pune, yes.
Yeah, I think I've tended to meet Vishal more in Delhi, although I know he comes from Pune. So it's been one of those things. But Nolathon is a very well-established Indian ATO, and I've met Vishal as he's delivered training to a wide variety of clients all across India, mostly in Delhi for some reason, as I said. So that's a brief introduction to our panel. I'm not going to spend too much time because of the delayed start, but also because I want to get to the heart of the session itself. So first, I'm going to throw it over to Stuart, because Stuart, you've been the lead examiner for ITIL 4. As I said, you were the person who helped design the level of difficulty, the style of the exams, what gets covered in each of the syllabi, and so on. So for our audience, would you be able to describe sort of the thinking behind the ITIL 4 exams, especially ITIL 4 Foundation?
Sure. So I'm mainly going to talk about the question writing, the style and approach of questions. But the first thing I want to say is that the whole exam is based on a syllabus. If you haven't read the syllabus, then go and read it before you even think about approaching an exam. The syllabus will tell you exactly what it told the people writing the exam questions, what's going to be examined, to what level of difficulty, how many questions on each topic. It will arm you with the information you need to prepare. The exam paper is a 40-question paper, and the questions are basically very straightforward. Every question has a 1 or 2 sentence introduction and then asks you to pick answer A, B, C, or D. And one thing that it's important to know is that out of those 4 answer options, one of them is definitively correct. It's not just better than the other answer options, it is completely, absolutely correct. And the other three answers are definitively incorrect. Again, they're not just worse than the right answer, they are wrong answers. That can be very helpful when you're coming to answer an exam question, because if you're not quite sure which is correct, you might well be able to identify all the wrong answers, because, as I said, they're not just worse than, they're definitively incorrect. There's only two levels on the Bloom's level that we use for setting these questions that we used in ITIL Foundation. Level 1, typically what it says in the syllabus is recall the definition of. Recall, remember, do you recognize this thing? And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Level 2 expects you to be able to describe something. So it might expect slightly different wording, slightly more knowledge and understanding of the concept. The syllabus is separated out into assessment criteria, and each one of those tells you what you're supposed to know, tells you at what level, Bloom's level 1 or 2, and also tells you how many questions there are. So, for example, one assessment criterion says recall the definition of, and then it lists service, utility, warranty, customer, user, service management, sponsor. So that tells you that you're likely to get 2 questions covering those definitions. And remember, each answer will have 1 that's correct and 3 that are incorrect. And when we were writing the exam questions, we had a number of rules that we tried to follow. We couldn't follow them 100% of the time for complex reasons, but most of the time we did. And one of those rules was that the wrong answers aren't allowed to just be a piece of nonsense. They actually have to be a real ITIL thing. So if the question said something like, what term defines the functionality of a service? And the correct answer was utility, then we might offer you as wrong answers warranty, customer, and user. It's not a real question, you understand. The point being, what we wouldn't do is offer you the correct answer utility and incorrect answers futility, mass spectroscope, and Akshay Anand. All of the things you see on the paper, with a certain very small number of exceptions that are there for good reasons, will be real ITIL things that are wrong. One of the assessment criteria says recall the purpose of the following ITIL practices, and then it lists 15 ITIL practices, and there are going to be 5 questions on this topic. So one of those is information security management. So I've just got on this other screen, just to make a point, I've got the Foundation book open in front of me. The purpose of the information security management practice is to protect the information needed by the organization to conduct its business. This includes understanding and managing risks to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, as well as other aspects. I'm not going to continue reading it. You won't get an exam question that lists that whole quite long purpose statement and says, which practice is this? One of the reasons for that is one of our other rules. We try not to have linguistic clues so that somebody who hasn't studied the topic can just look for the word. So if we said, which practice is designed to protect the information needed by the organization to conduct its business, it's got the word information in it. And if we then had the right answer being information security management and the wrong answer being other topics, that will be a linguistic clue that we wouldn't allow. So we're much more likely to write a question that says, which practice includes managing risks to confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And then we give you 4 potential practices. So when we say recognize the purpose, you need to know the purpose statement, but you're unlikely to get the whole of it just because we're trying to avoid giving clues of, oh, look, it's got the same word as one of the answers. A few other things I'd like you to think about. All of the questions are basic, simple, multiple choice questions. There is no case study. There is no need for you to analyze a situation to apply your judgment. Now, I've seen very experienced service managers get these questions wrong because they overthink it. Don't do that. The questions are there to check whether you've read and understood the terms and the concepts and the ideas in the ITIL book. We are not trying to judge your your ability to analyze a difficult situation and come up with the best answer. We're not there. So if you think you need to do that, you've misread the question. I'm just looking through.
Could I just interject there, Stuart? So this actually does lead me to a point where I have seen in certain social media platforms online, people sharing what they think is a sample question, but they're not sort of AXELOS sample questions, even though it's about ITIL. And the way to tell that is if you look at the sample paper, and we'll be covering some of the questions from that sample paper, you will see that the questions are fairly simple and straightforward. They're a sentence or 2 sentences maximum. It's not a massive scenario of a service manager is faced with a difficult customer who's complaining about X, Y, and Z, which we're not going to give you a scenario question at the foundation level. So if you see questions of that nature, sure, it might be helpful in helping you understand the concepts a bit further and to be a bit more comfortable with the subject matter. But just be aware, it's not an AXELOS sample question. So just be aware of that when you're trying to tackle it, because if you find it difficult to answer such questions, that's not the style of questions you're actually going to be answering on the proper exam.
Thank you, Akshay. That's a really important point. And the very last point I'd like to make about how the exam and the questions were designed is we worked very hard to try and keep all of the answer options to similar lengths. We've seen papers where the right answer was always the longest one because people kept adding detail to it to make sure it was right. There's none of that going on here. So the only time you'll see significant length differences is where we've quoted the actual purpose statements of 4 different things, and the purpose statements are different lengths, or we've given you, service level management as one example and service desk as another, which is much shorter, but they're equally the names of practices. But other than that, you should see answer options, similar lengths. Don't go with the old rule of the longest one is right. It probably isn't.
There is one more point I think which we do need to tease out. If I remember, this is all explained in the syllabus, if I'm not mistaken, but I believe I'm correct in saying that there are no negative questions. People won't be asked what is not the purpose.
Let me qualify that. We are allowed to ask negative questions, but only if the book specifies a negative point that people should understand. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but if something in the book says, be aware that the incident management practice is not used for managing changes, then we might ask that.
Right. Fair point. All right. So that was a really quick and brief overview of how we've designed the ITIL 4 Foundation exam, and I think Stuart's actually already shared quite a few tips. But I'll come back to you, Stuart, for another tip. But let's go around the panel, and I'll start again this time in the lower right of my screen. So Vishal, I'm going to come to you first. What tip would you share with our audience who are looking to take the ITIL 4 exam?
Sure. To be honest, I had a list. I knew Stuart was going to tell some of that already. So obviously, read the syllabus. That is quite an important document when you go ahead for the examination, and make sure that you understand each and every topic from the syllabus. So that's definitely the one. Practice purpose statements. I have seen people who work on that tend to do better in the exam. So focus on practice purpose statements. I don't know if it's really a tip, but it's definitely what I use I advise my students to do. Create some mind puzzles to memorize certain things. So if you really want to remember the flow of incident management, I'm not saying there'll be a question on that, but if you really want to remember a flow of incident management, come up with certain acronyms or certain things that are easy for you to remember, like DCMIRC, Does Cricket Match of India Receive Cheers? The actual meaning would be detect and record, classify, categorize, and so on. Let's not get into, at that level, but try to create some mind puzzles, which makes it easy for you to remember some topic. And that's not I mean, no one is going to take that away from you, I mean, in the exam or after the exam. And the trick that works for me always is I try to find out what are the right questions for remaining 3 wrong options. So you read a question, you know the right answer, but then there are 3 wrong options there, right? So if A is correct, you still have B, C, and D, which are not correct. So I try to go into my mind palace and see what would have been the right questions for these 3 wrong answers, which would make these 3 wrong answers right. I think that's it from my side.
Okay.
I'm sure I've eaten into some of the other tips.
All right, those were useful. Next, up to you, John. What tips do you share with your students?
The first one is make sure you answer the question that was asked. As Stuart talked about, there's a lot of correct statements that are in there. So make sure you answer the question that was asked. I like to say, hopefully students, when they read it, should be able to easily identify 2 that are incorrect. And when you have 2 that are incorrect and 2 that I think might be correct, go back and read the question. The other big hint I would have is, as you go through, if you go through and read, you know, A, B, oh, B's the right answer, your brain will not look as carefully at C and D. So I like to have people think, as you go through, think A could be a correct answer or B could be a correct answer. And that way, when you get done, if you have either just one that's could be correct, you're set. But if you have 2 that could be correct, go back, reread the question. You've probably missed a word someplace. And then just one quick second one, for those people that read too quickly, instead of reading A, B, C, D, read D, C, B, A. It will slow your brain down a bit and reduce the chance of you missing a word that could cause you to choose an incorrect answer. So that would be probably the two additional ones that I would add there.
Okay. Excellent. I wish somebody had told me that in some of my ITIL exams. Stuart, you've already shared a wealth of information. Are there any other tips that you would like to pass along to our audience?
I do have 2 tips I'd like to share. And the first one is nothing to do with helping you pass an ITIL exam. Hopefully, you're actually going to get some value out of what you're learning on an ITIL Foundation training course, and you're going to take that back so that you are more valuable to your employer. You're doing a better job. You've learned something. Now, a lot of what you'll learn on an ITIL Foundation course, you can't implement when you go back to work. We might teach you the purpose of an information security management practice. That's probably not going to be immediately practically helpful to you when you get back to work. The one thing I would like you to take away and actually use the day you get back is the guiding principles. These are 7 principles that you can use that will help you make decisions, prioritize work, and resolve conflicts. And my strong advice is that you take these 7 guiding principles, you print them out on the biggest sheet of paper that your printer will handle, you stick them up on the wall next to where you work, and you actively use them every day after you get back from the training course. That way, your ITIL training will be valuable to you and your employer. And then I got one quick tip to help you pass the exam. I have seen people get confused between the terms service value system, service value chain, and value stream. If you see one of these in an exam question or in an answer, go back and read it again and make sure you've got the right one. It's very easy to think you're being asked about a value stream when you're being asked about a value chain and vice versa. So if you see the word value in the question, read very carefully because there are a number of terms that include that word.
Very good point. Kakeru, we come to you next.
Yes, thank you. Some of my tips might be redundant. Perhaps I got 3 tips that I can share. The first one is please understand all the elements of the service value system and like service value chain or 4 dimensions, how are those components are related to each other, or how they are related to each other placed. You might want to create the 3D puzzle to be completed, but you can write it down on a piece of paper. What are those components and then how they are placed in each other. And then this should help to picture overall of each component. And the next one is processes or practices. As you can see in the syllabus, these gonna be the questions which will be asked the most. So you need to memorize the purposes, and then some of the practices, you need to understand the definition. So for example, some of the students might be misplaced the definition between like a released and deploy. There are slight different definitions. So please make sure you need to see the details of the purposes and then definition of the names of the practices. And the last one that I can share is about the guiding principles. As Stuart said, this is a very important item which we can use in when you're back to work. But for the exam, sometimes you need to be careful about the aspects of each guiding principles. For example, which principle applies under like improving quality or like improving customer experiences. When you hear those aspects of each principles, you need to identify which guiding principle applies. So that's what I can share for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Claire, what tips do you normally give your students when they're about to take the foundation exam?
So I've got 2 tips to share, one of which is very high level and one of which is a bit more detail focused. And the high level one is remember why you're actually taking the exam. So for most people, when we look at our customer satisfaction survey, they're taking an exam because they need as part of their role, or they're doing it for their own personal development. And when I was a classroom trainer before I moved into e-learning, I could generally spot some of the people who weren't going to do well in the exam because they were the people who came in and in the introduction said, I don't want to be here. My boss sent me. I'm not really interested, but you know, it's on my training plan, so I've got to be here. And I could be fairly confident that they weren't going to pass the exam. So I think, you know, you have people who are super motivated. They understand exactly why they want this. It's going to get them that next job. It's going to allow them to be promoted. But for people who maybe don't have such a clear understanding of why they're in that classroom or taking that e-learning course, find something. If you can find one thing in that training course that makes you think a little bit differently, it's worthwhile, and take that attitude into the exam. You know, life is short. Don't sit there with your arms folded and let a training course pass you by. So that's the high level tip. Going into much more detail, don't talk yourself out of the right answer. So it's definitely good practice to go through the paper, pick your answers, and then go back at the end. And like Stuart was saying, just double check, did I read value chain and it actually says value stream? So go back and do those checks, but don't talk yourself out of the correct answer, which is where we come back to this idea of trick questions. There isn't this group of evil examiners writing tricky questions to try and catch you out. If you're looking at a question, think, is that too simple? Maybe there was something, maybe I'm missing something. It's simple because you know the answer. So by all means, check, look for the obvious mistakes, but do not talk yourself out of the right answer, because I've seen some very, very clever people do that.
That's a fair point. I'd like to offer one tip as well, which is possibly slightly controversial. So I'm glad that we're doing this virtually, because I can mute all of you if you start shouting at me for giving a bad tip. But one of the things that Stuart did mention, which I think is also important to mention to the audience, is that there are no negative marks with ITIL exams. So if you get the wrong answer, you get 0. You don't get -1. when I've taken ITIL exams, I have been in a situation where I have looked at the question time and time again. For the life of me, I cannot figure out what the correct answer is or what the obviously bad answers are. I am genuinely stuck where I don't have a preference for any of the options. In those situations, and I hate to say this, I have guessed the answer because that at least gave me a 25% chance of getting 1 mark, as opposed to leaving it blank, which was a 100% chance of getting 0. So that is my tip as someone who's taken ITIL exams. If you're genuinely, absolutely stuck, you cannot figure out for the life of you what the right answer is, guess, because you have a 25% chance of getting 1 mark with that.
Actually, I'd like to just follow up on that one. That as you go through the exam, if you hit that question you don't know, skip it and come back to it. Absolutely. The odds are you will subsequently get to a question that will jar your memory. So rather than poring over it and getting frustrated, remembering that you can come back to it. And I did remember one other one that I use a lot with classes. And I think one thing is our tips don't work for everybody because we all think different, we all learn differently. But for a lot of people, I recommend flashcards. And there's a lot of great flashcard apps that can work on tablets and computers and phones. But that's sort of, I'll say, short-term memory for the exam because it is closed book. But taking that syllabus and using that to go through to sort of, recall some just quick words to associate with things, I think is a good technique for some people.
Does anybody remember there's an ITIL 4 app? I think it includes flashcards, but I might be wrong.
I believe it does. Vishal, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to go back to Akshay's point about guessing. Maybe, I just need your opinions on that. What I have noticed is when people sit through the class for the entire duration and they do all the exercises and all the reading that we as trainers give them, normally they may be guessing at the conscious level, but at the subconscious level, their guess is normally the right answer. So I don't know how that works, but I've seen that working most of the times.
Yeah, that is true. The second tip, before we go to the questions, there is a second tip. And unfortunately, this tip does not work in the COVID-19, everything's shut down scenario. Back when we used to be able to do things with paper exams, that's how I took all my ITIL exams. You were allowed to scribble on the exam paper, on the question booklet. You weren't allowed to scribble on the answer sheet, but you're able to scribble on the question booklet. And what I would sometimes do, especially if I'm using mnemonic devices like what Vishal was suggesting, that you make up a little acronym or something like that, I would come in and really the first thing I would do was to just scribble that acronym or that mnemonic down on the cover sheet, because in the heat of the moment, whilst I'm in that sort of time pressure trying to answer a question, I might misremember the mnemonic, or I might misremember something. So just scribbling it down on that piece of paper on the booklet would help. Now, again, that might not work if we're doing things online, but for those of you who are looking at taking a paper-based exam, or once we return to that paper-based world, that might be something that you would want to look into as well. But let's swiftly move on to talking about some of the questions. And here our producer, Harry Freeman, is going to do some broadcast magic and move our different pictures around the screen. And Harry, let me know when you're ready to go with question 1. You'll have to come off mute, Harry. Unfortunately, we have to hear your voice on this call. Okay, excellent. Claire, I'm going to feed you question number 1, actually. So question number 1, for all our panelists, we have about 10 questions. Obviously, we started a bit late and I'm keeping an eye on the clock. So let's take a couple of minutes to just describe how we might answer that question, how we might tackle that question. Maybe using some of the tips that's been discussed, or maybe not. That's entirely up to you. But Claire, I'll come to you with the first one. So which term describes the functionality offered by a service? Cost, utility, warranty, risk.
Thank you very much, Akshay. Here's hoping I get this one right. It's one of the things that I like to do, because this I have to be honest, this is a pure memory question. And if you sat through the course paying attention, like Vishal suggested, something will have gone in. If you had your ears shut or you were playing with your phone when this was discussed in your classroom training or your e-learning, you might find this one a bit more challenging. But what I like to do when I have a multiple choice question like this is see if I can get rid of anything immediately. You know, Stuart's told us as the examiner that there's nothing nonsensical, so there's no futility that we can rule out immediately, but we can start to look at, well, is there anything here that just doesn't make sense? So we're talking about the functionality that a service offers, and hopefully we're starting to think about that, meaning what does the service actually do? So I'm looking at these options and thinking, cost? Probably not. So if I'm Akshay and I'm sat there with my paper exam and my pencil, maybe I'll put a little bit of a line through that. And risk as well. If you were buying a service and one of the functionalities that it was offering you was risk, probably as a customer, you weren't going to be able to go ahead with that. So you're basically now choosing between two options. So even if you're in that uncomfortable position where you've got to guess, you've got a 1 in 2 chance rather than a 1 in 4 chance, which is already a better place to be. And some of the other panelists have been talking about using mnemonics and using little memory clues. And this is something that can work quite well for you here, because we've basically got utility and warranty. And hopefully you'll remember from your training that these are describing whether a service is fit for purpose. In other words, what does it do? And fit for use. In other words, how does it perform? Is it available? Is it reliable? Does it have sufficient capacity? So fit for purpose, fit for use. And one of the things that, you know, we always kind of say is the two U's don't go together. So the U in utility, the U in use don't belong together. Warranty is all about, is the service fit for use? Utility is all about, does it do the things that we require it to do? So that's the functionality that that service is offering you. So it's not a question, unfortunately, where I can tell you, here's the magic formula to get to the right answer. But to be honest, I don't think we're going to be able to do that for any of these questions. But it is one where it's testing you at that recall level. Did you hear and understand the definition? There are little tricks that you can use. And again, talking about things like flashcards, they're fantastic for definitions like this. So, you know, look at the question. If your brain immediately goes, oh, I don't know, you have the option that John suggested, which would be to move on and come back to it. And apparently your subconscious brain does work away on these things in the background. So that can be a very valid exam technique. But if it's one that you know you need to work through, start by dismissing the things that are more obviously wrong, shall we say, and then work your way logically through to the answer. And I'll let Akshay put me out of misery there and tell me I got that one correct,
so,
hopefully.
Animation, I think we'll have the correct answer highlighted for the audience. And which term describes the functionality of the service? It is absolutely utility, option B. But I do like that little tip of utility is not about use. The use don't go together. I think that's a lovely little technique. Thank you, Claire. Vishal, I'll come to you with question 2. Harry, if you could advance to question number 2.
Sure.
So I'll read it out loud. For those of you who are not watching but listening, identify the missing word in the following sentence. A customer is the role that defines the requirements for service and takes responsibility for blank of service consumption. What is that missing word? And the options are outputs, outcomes, costs, and risks. Vishal.
Okay. This one also is going to play on the similar lines as what Claire described earlier. So a customer is the role that defines the requirements for the service and takes responsibility for the costs of service consumption, for the risks of service consumption. I mean, I'm going to simply say that these are not the two that works well in this scenario. responsibility for the outputs and outcomes seems to be the two which you should struggle with ideally, because the cost and risks is not something which make the statement correct. And in this case, if you have sat through the course, sat through the training, you would remember that how outputs and outcomes are related to each other. So if you remember that, then the answer should be straightforward if I'm correct on this one. So the answer here then would come to you, outcomes of service consumption. Now this one is by selection, but you can also approach this by elimination. So I mean, you can use each term, each option into the statement and simply like say it in your mind, say it in your, or hear it yourself. If it does not look right, if it does not sound right, probably at the subconscious level, it is not correct. So I'm going to go with option B, outcomes.
Okay, Stuart, you raise your hand.
Just worth mentioning, because I didn't mention it earlier, there will be one or two of this missing word style of questions on each paper. There won't be many of them. And you note that all of the words we're offering are real ITIL terms again. This is the actual definition from ITIL of a customer, which you should have learnt. And the things that have been put up as options for you are real things that are not appropriate for this definition.
Thank you. John, I'll come to you next for question number 3.
Tell me I was right.
Sorry, actually, Harry, if you advance the slide, it should highlight B, outcomes is the correct answer. Keep in mind, you may recall as a student, you learned about sponsor, customer, and user. That should also hopefully trigger a memory there. Harry, if you can advance to question number 3. John, I'll come to you next. So the question is, which guiding principle recommends assessing the current state and deciding what can be reused? And the options are focus on value, start where you are, collaborate and promote visibility, or progress iteratively with feedback.
Okay, now that I've unmuted, I can restate. So this again, I think comes back to the read the question carefully. Where we're again recommends assessing the current state and deciding what can be reused. So this again, I think the first 3 questions are a bit about the ability to recall some of the definitions for what's there. So as we come through, we always want to focus on value. Start where you are is about what? Knowing where we are, but also start where you are is also about understanding what you have that can be reused. And so this is a case where I think it becomes important from a studying and preparation viewpoint that there's more in this guiding principle, as there are in several of them, than just what we typically see in that brief statement that comes out there. All right? We've got collaborate and promote visibility. Well, yes, we know we want to collaborate. We know we want to promote visibility, but that really isn't so much about assessing the current state and deciding what can be reused. But obviously, there may be some collaboration as we go through that. And again, the progress iteratively with feedback, that's a bit of, do something, assess where you are, and then figure out the next step. But really, we're coming back to part of the overall definition for these. And so to me, as I go through this, it's not only take the focus on value, start where you are, collaborate and progress iteratively, but from a testing viewpoint, know what a little bit beyond that of what else might be included in that. As Stuart talked about earlier, I think the other thing coming back, and when I go through and teach, I like to make clear that when I'm teaching the class, I don't teach for the exam because we don't know what all the questions are as trainers. So I like to have people understand what these mean and understand how to use them. And I think the whole key point to me is the more you understand what these are and understand how to apply them, then the easier it is to answer the exam question. So let me come back. I guess the answer I'm saying is B, bravo. Start where you are.
And Harry, if you progress the animation, I think that should be the correct answer. Absolutely. The way I approach this question is it's asking you what you need to do to understand where you are right now. It's not saying that you need to do something. So we're not looking to progress, we're looking to assess. We're not looking to move forward. So that allows me to eliminate D, delta, for example. You may need to collaborate in order to assess the current state, but you can collaborate to do other things. So collaborate, promote visibility for me is much more than just assessment. So from that point of view, for me, that's how I eliminate Charlie or C. So for me, it came down to focus on value versus start where you are. And of course, when you're assessing current state, you want to focus on what is valuable, what's useful, etc., etc. But it's about deciding what can be reused. I come to the second part of that question statement, and what can be reused as you begin some sort of change or transformation after having done an assessment. So for me, that's why I would have landed on start where you are, because you're figuring out what you can take forward when you, what can be reused as you move forward. So that's the way I look at that question. But moving swiftly on, yeah.
I think you brought out another great hint on that one, and that is what's the verb in the question. And I think that can be true in a lot of questions. Come back to the verb. It's assess, or it's a take action, or it's a do something. But if you come back to the verb, again, if you're having a question of I don't know which one, come back in the reading and come back to what's the verb, and that can help you understand, I think, which is the correct answer.
Yeah, that's a good tip, John. Thank you. And Harry, if you move on to the animation, through the animation, we will see that bravo, start where you are, is the correct answer. Moving on, question 4, Harry. Stuart, I'll come to you for this one. Which statement about change authorization is correct? And there's a long list, which I'm not going to read out in the interest of time, but how would you go about answering this question?
I hate this question. Why do I hate this question? It's very, very wordy. Now, I'm lucky I'm a native English speaker. We did try not to have questions this long because they are very challenging for people who are not native English speakers, so you won't see many of them. But sometimes it's the only way we could examine something that was quite important. So there's a style of question here. Which statement about change authorization is correct? So there could be about any aspect of change authorization. That also makes it a bit challenging, but let's look at them. A change authority should be assigned to each type of change and change model. Now, as it happens, that's the right answer, but let's assume I have no idea what that's talking about and skip past it for the minute. B, centralizing change authorization to a single person is the most effective means of authorization. The whole ethos of change enablement, and one of the big changes, no, it's not a change, but one of the big shifts in emphasis between earlier versions of ITIL and what we're writing about in ITIL 4 is this idea that you need to delegate change authorization. You need to avoid having a monolithic, consolidated central place for change authorization. So B is definitively wrong. It's exactly what we tell people not to do. So C, the authorization of normal changes should be expedited to ensure they can be implemented quickly. Well, I guess you should expedite normal changes to ensure. So that's a possible right answer. But I happen to remember that this phrase is used in a description of a standard change within the book, that it says standard changes should be expedited. But nonetheless, it is a possible right answer. You certainly don't want to slow changes down, do you? And then D, standard changes are high risk and should be authorized by the highest level of change authority. That's an easy one to eliminate because standard changes are low risk, repeatable changes. So we can eliminate D, we can eliminate B, and I'm left with A or C. So let's look at this. Does the type of change and the change model determine the change authority? Absolutely it does. I know that each type of change has a change model associated with it, and within that change model, we say who the change authority should be. So that makes A definitely correct. C, if C said the authorization of standard changes should be expedited, it would be definitely correct. So for me, it's wrong because it's taken a true statement and changed it to apply to the wrong type of change. So I'm going to answer A.
And I believe that is a correct answer, Harry. If you move through the animations, I think it will show that option A is the correct answer. I don't know if this is necessarily a tip for our listeners, but one thing that I found useful in answering ITIL questions is to ask myself is whether an option would be correct in a particular context or whether it would be universally correct. And for me, that's how I would decide between A and C. Charlie, the authorization of normal changes should be expedited to ensure they can be implemented quickly. Yes, it can be correct in a certain context, but it's not universally correct. And the question doesn't say which statement about change authorization is mostly correct or contextually correct. It is definitively, i.e. universally correct. And for me, C is a very contextual application of the guidance. It's not universal. And that's the way I eliminate C in this sort of a question. Thank you, Stuart. Moving on to question number 5, Kakeru, we come to you. So this is another type of question that we didn't talk about earlier, which is lists, where we present 4 statements to the students and ask them which combination of 2 statements is correct. So here we have a question along the lines of, well, how does a customer engagement contribute to service level management practice? And we've got 4 statements. It captures information that metrics can be based on, ensures the organization can meet defined service levels, defines the workflows for service requests, and it supports progress discussions. And which combination of these 4 statements is the correct one? Kakeru, over to you.
Yep. So this type of question, as actually mentioned, some people do not like it. I don't like it either, because you need to think sort of twice. And also the choices are a bit longer. So you need to think a little bit. And then this question is from a sample paper, and I see many people choose the wrong choice on this one. So you need to be very careful. So it's about the engagement. So you need to know the terminology, what the engagement mean. And then some people think all about the service level, but this is asking about the engagement contribute. So you don't need to talk about the whole thing about the service level. So if you look at the choices, the one, it captures the information that metrics can be based on. So service level at the beginning of the process practice of these engagement, you need to set the standard, what's good or what's bad about the service level. So it can be good, and you can leave this one. The second choice says ensure the organization meets defined service levels. And this might be good, but you need to ask yourself, is this about the customer engagement, or because it's talking about if it meets the defined service level or not. So this should be happening after operating or providing services. So you may think this may be wrong. And then the third choice, it says it defines the workflows of the service requests. So you need to trigger yourself that the service request is something different. This is talking about the service level. So this should be something different practices. And then the last choice, it says it supports progress discussions. So it is at the state of a customer engagement. So this can be good. So after selecting overall, the answer should be delta, the D, 1 and 4. I hope I'm getting it right.
That is the correct answer. Sorry, I just need to send our producer Harry a message. Stuart, please, you raised your hand. Go ahead.
I wanted to talk about the style of question. There will be one or two of these on each paper as well, not many. They will always have 4 numbered options, numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the 4 answers, A, B, C, and D, will always be exactly the same. It will always be A is 1 and 2, B is 2 and 3, C is 3 and 4, D is 1 and 4. Now, in case you haven't noticed, that means that some combinations will never come up. The correct answer cannot be 1 and 3. The correct answer cannot be 2 and 4. Those options are not in there. This is important. It means if you look through the 4 options and you see one that you know is wrong, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, 3 is definitely wrong. Now that gives me a bit of a clue because it eliminates both B and C. I'm now left with either 1 and 2 or 1 and 4. I no longer need to waste my time on 1. Just check it. Have a look at 2 and 4. That's what will determine which is the right answer, which of those is right and which is wrong. Saves a bit of time.
That's a fair point, and I was going to share that tip as well, because that's how I approach these. I look for the one that I definitely know is correct, and then I look for the options which has that statement in there, and then I eliminate the others. And so it's a question of then deciding which of the other 2 are more plausible or correct. I do have another 5 questions that I thought we would have time to go through, but we've been having such an amazing discussion going through the various tips as well as looking at some of these questions. I don't think we have the time to cover the rest of the questions. So instead, if everyone's okay with it, I'd like to switch to some of the questions that have come in from our audience in the 10 minutes that we have remaining. And I'd like to pick up something that seems to have gotten quite a bit of commentary and chatter on over on YouTube, which is how long should somebody study for the ITIL Foundation exam, which is sort of a how long is a piece of string type of question. And the folks in the audience seem to have a bit of a consensus that 10 days is sufficient. As trainers, obviously you're delivering your sessions in different styles and different durations. Some people, like Claire, I assume that the ITSM Zone's ITIL Foundation course is self-paced, so you can take anywhere from, well, 1 day to 1 month. But typically, what are people's experiences with their typical candidates? How long do you recommend, or how long do you find that your students need? Let's start with John first, and then I'll come to Claire.
I'm doing most of my, I'll say, instructor-led. So, and in today's world, it could be 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Sometimes it's full days, it's half days. I like to come back and say, if we're in a continuous run of 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, within 2 to 3 days after finishing the class, take the exam. Beyond that, you're going to start to forget things. I like to think a couple hours after that. So if it's a instructor-led class, you're going to have a couple hours. I like to, when I'm going through it, sort of review each day and review those things there. But I'd say within 2 to 3 days, I'm going to say if you take more than 10 days, you're going to have to significantly increase the amount of study time, because 1, you forget things. And then 2, I just want to come back and just one other hint. When you take the exam, you have to take off the hat of the organization that you're working for. And you have to put on your ITIL hat, and you have to kind of drop, this is how we do it, and how have we talked about it. And when you're stressed, you revert to how we do it, which I'm going to assume is legitimate. There's lots of good reasons that you do it that way, and that's what ITIL is about. But when you're taking the exam, you've got to take off, and put on that your ITIL hat that you went through training and answer the questions in that mode. But 2 to 3 days, I think, is optimal. Anything more than 10, up the study time, because you're going to be forgetting things.
That's a fair point. I mean, there's no sort of context behind the question, but I was assuming that the person who asked the question was thinking more in terms of studying after work, in the evenings, before dinner or something like that. And if they could only give an hour per day, how long would they take? 10 in that, from the maths of that, 10 days does sound about right, 10 hours to review everything. But I do share that concern, John, that, by the time you get to day 10, you've probably forgotten what you studied in day 1. Claire, you'd had your hand up as well. What's the experience from an online perspective?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to comment on this because I went from being a classroom trainer for ITIL, so I was classroom for version 2 and 3, and now we create e-learning. And the kind of the 2 to 3 days in the classroom is very, very good. But what we used to find is that a lot of the delegates had the exam kind of hanging over their heads. So they were learning, they were interested, but there was also that little part of their attention that was always thinking, yes, but what about the exam? Is this going to be on the exam? With the e-learning, what we find is people take longer, and what we try and recommend that they do is actually pause and apply what they're learning. So, for example, if there's a section in the course that's covering value streams, pause there, go back to work, have a chat with your colleagues, start to think about what that might look like in your workplace. So that does start to kind of reinforce what you're learning and allow the delegate to think beyond the exam. So I think to this question, there is no perfect answer. You will have your own learning style. I think everybody's had concentration breaks in 2020. Who can focus on anything for more than 30 minutes this year? But get the maximum from whichever type of training you're undertaking. If you're self-studying, make sure you're setting the time aside with no distractions. If you're in the classroom, if it's possible, put your phone to one side, focus on what's going on, join in the discussions. If you're taking an e-learning course, use the pauses, use the breaks to go and apply things in the workplace. If your deadline for the exam is tomorrow, you have to take it. You can do an all-nighter and you'll probably pass. But, comes back to, why am I doing this? When do I need to do it by? And what is my personal learning style as well?
Absolutely right. A second question, which is probably the last question that we can take in the interest of time. I think, Stuart, I'll probably direct this question to you. We had a question about whether candidates should expect to know the difference between what was covered in ITIL version 3 and how things might have changed with ITIL 4 at a foundation level.
No, not at all. There is no requirement to have studied ITIL version 3, to be familiar with ITIL version 3. There is a small risk that because of changes between ITIL version 3 and ITIL 4, people who are very familiar with ITIL v3 could get things wrong if they don't actually pay attention on their training, and some things are described differently, are defined slightly differently. So absolutely not, no. Well, one thing it's worth pointing out, we had a kind of overriding philosophy behind the exam, which was a candidate who is not entirely stupid and who attended the course and who bothered to pay attention should be able to pass. We weren't trying to trick people. We were just saying, did you come on this course and pay attention? So somebody very familiar with ITIL v3 who didn't pay attention during an ITIL 4 course because they already knew it all might well fail.
That's a fair point. I'm going to start the whole wrap up of this. There are a few things I'd like to share with our audience. If you register on AXELOS.com, there is a publicly available sample paper of 40 questions, just like the real exam. And you can get what's also called a rationale booklet, which tells you what the correct answer is and why that's the correct answer, and equally why the other answers were the wrong answers. So it includes quotes from the text and so on. It's a marvelous resource to take a look at. Once you've passed ITIL 4 Foundation, of course, or once you've registered for the ITIL 4 Foundation course, you, if you've, I believe there's a checkbox that you want to receive notifications or emails. If you've checked that, and please do make sure you check that, you will get a message, an email inviting you to join what we call My AXELOS. It's a section of the AXELOS.com website where you can find more information behind that registration wall. You can find each of the 34 practices in all their glorious detail. You will find white papers, you will find toolkits and other sorts of resources that will help you apply what you've learned in your class to your day-to-day job. I would be remiss to not plug the app. I think Stuart mentioned the app halfway through the live stream. The app is available on Google Play Store as well as the iOS Store, and that through a fictional scenario, I believe it's a hotel service or lodging services, allows you to explore the various concepts and models of ITIL 4, as well as answer some of the questions therein. The last resource, which I think I'd like to also highlight, is social media. There are a number of social media platforms, LinkedIn, Reddit, Twitter, even our own Facebook group and other Facebook groups, where you can ask questions to other members of the community, other professionals about for their tips, for their suggestions. Even if you're struggling with understanding a specific concept, you're not able to get any joy out of the training materials you have, which, with all due respect to everybody on this call, you're wonderful trainers, but sometimes some people might just say, you know what, I'm just not getting it, and they want to seek somebody else's opinion. There are some wonderful people out there, practitioners out in the field, who can say, look, this is how I internalized it. This is my understanding of it. Maybe that would be of help to you as well. So on Reddit, r/ITIL is definitely a place to look at. If you look for ITIL 4 on LinkedIn, there are a few different groups where you can pose questions, you can ask other people for help. Certainly each of us whose profiles you can find through the LinkedIn event, we're all active on LinkedIn, and you can connect with us if that's the way you want to go. The TSO app as well, sample paper. There's a wealth of resources out there to help you pass your ITIL 4 Foundation exam. So without further ado, let me close this off now. I'd like to say a huge thanks to every one of this wonderful panel, especially John, who joined in before business hours started, and to Kakeru, who has been staying up pretty late out there in Japan. So, and a special thanks for all of you, but sincere thanks to everyone who gave us some of your time today. Thank you as well to our lovely audience. We'll have a look at some of the chat messages that you've been posting on LinkedIn, as well as on the YouTube live stream, to figure out if there are any questions we couldn't answer today, and we'll try to figure out a good way to answer those questions. Maybe we'll do another live stream just like this, who knows. So until we meet again, everyone, take care of yourselves, wear a mask, and remember to wash your hands.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.